Well, I have been thinking about this for a while, but I was reluctant to make a video about it because it is a topic that's been covered pretty well and pretty thoroughly by a lot of people, and not just by libertarians. But part of the reason I do this channel is just to get stuff off my chest, and it's something that I have been thinking about a lot, and so I thought I'd just put it out there for what it's worth. Probably nothing too original here, but a couple months ago I did a series of videos on why certain people hate Ron Paul, and I did one on conservatives. Why conservatives don't like him, why liberals don't like him, and then I did another one titled "Why Politicos Don't Like Him." Well, this one I want to talk about the media, which does kind of overlap with the other two, but it's becoming a cliche truism now that the media does not like Ron Paul, and that they almost completely overtly are attempting to thwart his presidential aspirations to a degree that is unbelievably blatant. And the evidence for this is manifold. And Jon Stewart is, several times now pointed this out to hilarious effect. The whole idea that, well, let me just start by saying, as it stands right now, this really is a two-person race with Romney, to be sure, the more likely to win. As much as I am a Ron Paul fan, I think we all have to admit that Romney is the guy who is the man to beat, and that he has a commanding lead. Not really in terms of the delegate count, because there's not that many delegates that have been signed yet, and Paul has almost as many as Romney does, but just because he has so much money and he has so much establishment. But if you look at the other candidates, they cannot really even raise very much money. They don't have large organizations. Several of them, like Gingrich and Santorum, aren't even on the ballot in a number of the states. They don't have any particular message where there's no enthusiasm for them. People don't show up to their events in droves as they do to Paul's. They don't have a great deal of enthusiasm. They have no appeal in terms of a general election. They have no appeal to independents or liberals. So the only credible and objective analysis of the election right now, the primary, is that it's probably going to be Romney, and the only person who really stands a chance of beating him is Ron Paul. And the other discussion is that in terms of a competition with Obama, it is the same two candidates again, Paul and Romney. And I am very sure, if it came down to that Romney would lose an election to Obama. And I don't want to say that I'm sure, but I'm leaning towards the idea that Paul would win an election against Obama. Not because all Republicans will love him, but because they will still vote for him anyway, even if they have severe misgivings. But many independents, and even some Democrats, will support Paul over Obama. Not as many as they should, because there's not that many that are that intellectually honest, but enough to make it a closer election, something that Paul would likely win. But if you look at the media, the consensus is that Romney's probably going to win unless Gingrich gets it together or Santorum gets it together. But they would probably prefer, or even state, that Michelle Bachmann, who has dropped out of the race, has better odds than Ron Paul. And this isn't uniform. Not everybody in the media hates Ron Paul. The most obvious exceptions are mostly to be found on Fox Business. I think the outstanding one is Judge Napolitano, and to a lesser extent John Stossel. Now, I actually worry that Napolitano is too pro-Paul, and I worry that he might lose his... he might somehow lose his show or something, because he has bias for Paul, which is great, and I think he's honest about it, but he's a little too pro-Paul. Stossel too. But then there's also Neil Cavuto. Now, I don't really agree with Neil Cavuto that much. I doubt he's a libertarian. I doubt he's anything close to me politically. But he has always been very fair to Ron Paul. I remember way back, right after the financial crisis hit in 2008, Cavuto did an interview with Ron Paul, and he basically, to his great credit, and I'll never forget this, admitted, you've come on this program, you've predicted this, you have said this would happen, I didn't believe you, no one else believed you, we mocked you, we said you were wrong, and you were right, you know, you called it, And he didn't have to say that. He could have pretended like it never happened. We'd all go watch the YouTube clips of the past and we would know, but he came up front and he said it. And he's always been very fair to him. And very recently, after the Iowa caucus, or maybe just before, he did a segment where he basically said that the media has to be fair to him. They should try and be objective. And he even singled out one of his co-workers, so to speak, colleagues. Is it Chris Wallace? Oh, I'm going to say Mike Wallace, but that's his father, I believe, by name. And I think that had to have been difficult for him to do. I wonder if there would be any repercussions for that. Apparently not. Maybe he has a great contract, so he doesn't have to worry. But by and large, the media hates Ron Paul, and they are extremely biased against him. And there's so many examples of this. I recall way back in the last election cycle when he was getting interviewed by Google News, and Google was interviewing all the candidates, and they would ask Paul questions like, well, what about an old woman who has no money and she gets in a horrible accident and none of her family will take care of her, and what's going to happen to her in a libertarian society? Isn't she going to die a horrible death? And, I mean, that's a tough question. That's like hypothetically the worst possible policy situation you could be in. And that's what but then Hillary Clinton comes on there and they ask, wow, you're very popular. Could you please take some time to expound on how great you are? And then she would literally take 20 minutes talking about how great she is, and she even like stood up from her seat and like started, and it was almost like they started playing inspiring music, in the background. But another like clear thing is how they treat like these newsletters, why they keep bringing that up. What was the other thing? There's something he said that the other people, I mean, that he doesn't get a pass on, but the others do. And I think there's a couple reasons for it. One is that they honestly disagree with his policies, and with him, he has pretty aberrant views on so many issues that it depends on the issue. For liberals, it's his domestic policy that they can't stand, that they have a whole slew of religious beliefs that what he's advocating would be horrible. If you talked, I just saw a comment on a Facebook page that said, oh yeah, I'll vote for Paul if I want everyone to, abolish minimum wage and pollution everywhere, and abortion to be abolished. And now none of that's really technically true. I mean, in fact, most of those are just absurd myths that have no basis in fact whatsoever, that are actually false on their face. Like the idea that without minimum wage laws, we would all be working $1 a day in a sweatshop. Well, if that was true, if government mandated minimums were the only reason anybody had ever got a raise, then nobody would make more than government mandated minimums right now. Why is it that so many workers make more than minimum wage right now? If the government's not making them do it, what's the reason? And liberals don't have a clue. They don't know anything about economics, and they don't know how there's competition for labor, and so employers bid up wages trying to get the best labor force that they can, because there's an advantage to having them. They don't understand that. They have all these myths, about pollution, and obviously he'd not ban guns enough, so we'd have crime in the streets, because obviously gun control lowers crime, because there's tons of scientific evidence to prove that, and so on and so forth. And now, so for them, he's basically bashing their religion. Their religion is statism. They believe in a big Leviathan government that takes care of everybody, and he's basically saying that's not a good idea. But I think that, or not even that, but that it's evil, and that he would. But he's also said that he would not abolish the welfare state right away. He would abolish the empire first. He's pretty explicit about that, and he is pretty well known for being pretty honest. Not all the time 100%, but pretty close. And I think you could take his word on it. The other thing is his foreign policy for liberals. There are a lot of liberals who either are Zionists or who are afraid of Zionists. And so for him to say he would cut aid to Israel just strikes some as unbelievably anti-Semitic. And there's so much fear-mongering with Iran and such that they think that means he wants another Holocaust. Again, that's totally absurd, but they believe it. Now, I don't know why there's a left bias in the media. Everybody knows there is. I think the only real answer must be that there's something that the same traits that make people want to be media people are the same traits that tend them to make them be liberal. And I don't know if those are inherited traits or if they're things that just develop. In any event, that's why liberals. Now, conservatives, it's a little bit more nuanced, and you can actually kind of tell in their and how they approach him, because Paul's position is rhetorically very similar to theirs. In fact, rhetorically, he is far better. He is the most pure, radically consistent adherent to the so-called limited government constitutionalism of the Republicans and of conservatives. And in fact, there's nobody who's even close to him except for the one or two people who are kind of like his political offspring, and in one case, literal offspring. They talk about constitutions and limited government and cutting spending, but they don't propose anything that's even remotely serious, and he does. And he talks about, they all will quote the Constitution, but it's basically just a prop. It's just something to, wrap your nationalism in. Well, he looks at it as a legal document that needs to be enforced, or not enforced, but that the government needs to adhere to it. He's one of those who thinks the Constitution is binding on the federal government, actually not on anybody else. And this is embarrassing to them. They can't attack him for that. The conservatives will attack him on the foreign policy, just like the liberals will. But on the domestic policy, they can't attack him on that way. Really. And so their main kind of tactic is to ignore him, and that's why we have all this, he doesn't count, they just remove him from the polls, they remove him from the commentaries when they talk about who's a contender. Or when they do talk about him, which they have to some of the time, there's always the qualification. He's not going to win. He has a ceiling. He's, by the way, doubled past the ceiling that he supposedly had. I remember watching the last election, or early in this election, people like Bill Kristol saying, look, there's a libertarian segment and it's 10%. That's his ceiling. Well, okay, he's double that right now. He's double the 10% right now. So obviously that ceiling wasn't really there. Now maybe Kristol was just wrong. It's possible he is after all a buffoon. But I think that it's just, we have to find some reason to say he can't. And the other thing they say, he's not electable. They just say he's not electable, he's not electable, he's not electable, he's not electable. This, of course, there's no reason to assume he's less electable than any of the others. In fact, look at someone like Santorum. He loses his Senate seat. Gingrich gets driven out of the House. None of them are inherently more electable than he is. That is just an excuse to not talk about him and to not address the issues that he brings up, because they're not comfortable with that. No one's comfortable confronting somebody who is they're better, and I mean that in the sense that their bread and butter is being we're the small government people, and he shows his actual adherence to that demonstrates their hypocrisy in such a way that they cannot bear to look at it, and so they avert their eyes and they try and avert ours. But I think there's another thing that's beyond ideology here. Within the mainstream media, I would think that many of the people in every industry, it's not just the media. Whenever someone has a job, or especially a career, something that they aspire to, there's a tendency to overrate the relative importance of that career to all others. So people who are, I'm in an oil field right now. If you talk to oil rig workers or people who are associated with the industry, they're going to tell you things like, there wouldn't be society if there wasn't for oil and blah, blah, blah. But you talk to a doctor, it's the same thing. You talk to a teacher, it's the same thing. You talk to a truck driver, anybody, they're all going to say that what they do is the linchpin of society at large. The guys who dig the coal, the guys in the auto factory, all of them. And of course, politicians have this about 100 times worse than the most egotistical private sector people. But just below politicians is the media. I think they all look back to Walter Cronkite and say, Walter Cronkite said everybody in America believed and everybody respected him. Now, that's probably an exaggeration, but that's what they think, that they should be basically the dictators not in the political sense, but in the sense that they speak, then we repeat, of the news, of public opinion, of, of our cultural awareness. That's been challenged by the alternative media, mostly by the internet, but also things like FM radio and whatnot. Now, I think that sometimes the stage we're at in that regard has been exaggerated. I mean, some people think that the internet has supplanted television and radio more than it has. I think eventually one day it will, but we're only partway through that process at this time. You know, television still is an amazingly powerful medium. But what the mainstream media, what I'm driving at here, is that they are upset and take personal offense to this glaring problem with their worldview of themselves as the purveyors of wisdom, or whatever, because they look at Ron Paul, they say, we're not going to endorse him, we're going to shun him, we're going to pretend he doesn't exist, and he still has popularity and power, and growing popularity and power and influence. And that must be so frustrating. It'd be like a truck driver going to, say, his vendors, say at Walmart or some other business, and saying, you need me so bad that if I didn't deliver to you, you wouldn't even have a business. And then they stop delivering, and lo and behold, Walmart finds other ways to keep its shelves stocked. And that would grate you so bad. That would make you feel, that would challenge your very identity. And that, I think, is personally behind a lot. This is why they're so dismissive of these polls. And that's why they're so dismissive of people who vote for him. And they just say there must just be this tiny fanatical religious cult that worships him, and all of us will turn up at every single poll. And this is not possible. We can't all turn up at these events. There's nobody who goes to all his events other than his staff. He has an appeal to a segment of the United States population. Now, I agree. I don't think it's a majority, not by far. I think it's a minority, but it's not 1%. It's more like, it's probably 10 or 15%. And then in terms of electoral politics, there are more people who probably don't agree with him that much, but they would still vote for him just because on the right issues, he's the right candidate. His support is rather eclectic. If you go to his meetings, there are going to be anarchists there. There will be libertarians. There'll be hippies with nappy hair. And there'll actually be actual Republicans who just take fiscal responsibility a lot farther than what they're getting from the party's elite. But the media doesn't want to admit that they don't have the power to affect how everybody thinks. So they just pretend this is some aberrant radical cult, and they try and ignore them, and they take personal. They want to believe that they have more power than they do. Many of them, I believe. Many of them, not all of them. I mentioned some examples. There's some other. Dylan Ratigan on MSNBC has usually been fair. There's a couple who have been fair. Cenk Uygur, I think he's been fair. He obviously has, retarded liberal bias, but at least he puts them on there and will admit some of the stuff. But I think that it's an affront to their pride. I think that's what it really comes down to, and they cannot stand it. So. They don't have a right to a monopoly. They've been granted one by the state. That's a whole other video, but obviously for television specifically, and the main broadbands, or the main airwaves and radio, the state granted oligopolies, not strictly monopolies, but oligopolies to 3 or 4 corporations in the 1920s, and they pretty much figure they're entitled to controlling public opinion. And they're losing that. And they've been losing it, and it's not because of Ron Paul. Like I said, it's because of the internet. But Ron Paul is demonstrating this. He's the evidence that it's true. That's, we could look and say, well, more Americans are getting their news from, online sources than they are from the television. But that doesn't really, that's not really a qualifiable or even really quantifiable thing. You could say, oh, their ratings go down a little bit, but But to have them have somebody that they categorically reject and almost uniformly reject, and yet have them still be popular, despite all of the attacks and all the claims of racism that they just dig up ad nauseum, and all the claims of homophobia and all the claims that he's dangerous and whatever, and he still has rising power and popularity. That must anger them so much. The only people who are angered more, I'm sure, is the government itself. Because, like I said, even though the media is conceited about their role, the government's even worse. And of course, there's a reciprocity there because the media and the government, to a large extent, cooperate with each other. So, I mean, if people in government are really antagonistic towards Paul, it's not unreasonable to think that some of that antagonism would come through to the reporters. But anyway, that's my take. I'm not saying Ron Paul's going to win. I think he has a chance. I think it's a fair chance. I hope that he does. But as we all know, he's not aiming for the White House so much as right here. And that's something the media really can't stop anymore. So that's good. All right, that's it.